Okay, we'll get started here. Welcome to the Disinfection Requirements Rule, DRR we'll call it throughout the webinar, the Sample Siting Plans webinar. Now this is just a little sound check screen so that if anybody would read this, if they're don't have the audio, then they'll know to reconnect. Just some logistics for the webinar here today. All your phones should be on mute by default by the system, but if at some point it seems that you're off mute, if you could mute your own phone, because we get a lot of background noise and everything if that happens. Save your questions till the end. We'll go through the presentation here, and then we'll have an open time that you can type questions in, and we'll take some time to respond to as much as we can. The session today is being recorded, so we'll post it on the website, on the DRR website, which will also tell you where to find that at the end of the presentation. So for those that miss it, or if you want to go back to anything. Okay, today in the room, I'm Bill McNamara, the Training Section Chief, doing the presentation here today. And I also have Dawn Hisner, the Operations and Monitoring Division Chief, and Jeff Allgeier, the Operations Section Chief. And I'll do the presentation, and then we'll all be here for the Q&A. We're all part of the DRR work group, Dawn being the lead on the reg. All right, so the agenda for today and for this webinar is we're going to explain this Disinfection Requirements Rule, DRR, Sample Siting Plan requirement. We're going to go through a couple different examples to show you the sample siting plans, talk about some further web resources, and then we'll do the Q&A session like I talked about there. All right, so some background on the requirements rule. The new rule is intended to increase public health protection, and it's intended to guard against microbial contamination by ensuring the adequacy of disinfection treatment and the integrity of drinking water system distribution systems. So how do we do that here? Well, you know, the existing requirement is to maintain a detectable residual, which we define as 0.02 milligrams per liter, and that was determined to not be protective of public health. So the new requirement is to maintain the minimum residual disinfectant concentration of 0.2 milligrams per liter throughout the distribution. That begins April 29th of next year. Who is affected by the DRR? All community water systems, non-transient non-community water systems that use chlorine as disinfectant, and then there are transient non-community water systems that are also included. Those would be the ones that have surface water filtration or filtration of a goody source or groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. And those transient systems that have installed 4-log disinfection of a groundwater source. So we got this webinar notice out to all these groups, and that's who we're targeting. Okay, so let's get into how we're actually looking at residuals. The rule requires you to collect a disinfectant residual at least once per week. That begins April 29th of 2019. You collect at the same time and locations as your coliform samples, first of all, and then collect at least one additional disinfectant residual measurement each week that a coliform sample is not collected. What we're going to talk about today then is this requirement to submit a DRR sample siting plan to DEP, and that's due by October 29th of this year. And DEP has a template that is really considered an addendum to the RTCR, or Revised Total Coliform Rule, plan that you did a couple years back now. Before we get into our addendum template, let's talk about the required elements of the plan, and then you'll see how those fall into the template itself. So the first required element is a list of distribution system representative sample site locations. First of all, like we said, it's the same locations as coliforms under the RTCR because you're sampling at those same time and locations. Samples must be representative of the distribution system. So you'll see we'll get into what that means and what you select in the plan. So here's the list of the 8 that you'll see in the template: dead ends, finished water storage tanks. You recognize a lot of these from the RTCR sample siting plan. So for systems, smaller systems, what if you only sample for coliforms under RTCR once or twice a month? Maybe you only have 1 or 2 locations, and now you have to do this weekly monitoring. Well, you can add additional representative locations for the disinfectant residual sampling, or you can alternate between RTCR locations if you do have 2 locations, and we'll show you an example of that. Really small systems can sample at the 1 location that they have, but it's just weekly monitoring. Second required element of the plan is to indicate whether each sample is also used as a coliform, a disinfection byproduct, or a lead and copper sampling location, because some of these will certainly overlap. Third requirement element is to indicate if the sample location is within a mixing zone, and this is for systems that use chlorine and purchase water from a system using chloramines, or vice versa, a system using chloramines and purchasing water from a system using chlorine. So it's for those specific purchasing systems, you know what your mixing zones are. Fourth required element of the plan is to indicate whether you're using online monitoring out in the distribution river, this is, or if you'll be using grab sample measurements, which would probably be predominantly the case. The fifth element is the sample collection schedule. This is the one element that we'll definitely spend some time on because it's certainly different than the RTCR. Just like RTCR, though, samples are to be representative through space and time, and that's what we're focused on here with time. So you know that the rule requires it must be sampled weekly now in the distribution for disinfectant residual. But you're not sampling every location weekly. The plan will ask you to identify which weeks you're sampling each location. And when you start to look at this, there isn't a solid 4 weeks in every month. That would only come out to 48 weeks in a year. So we'll give some examples of this here. You'll see that if you're collecting a residual, say, every every Thursday, and in July, you would have 4 weeks if you're collecting for the disinfection residuals on every Thursday. You get to August, and you hit your 4th week, and then, whoop, there's 5 Thursdays in August. So you actually need a 5th week identified for some locations. So we'll get back to this when I show you some examples, but this is the one part that's a little different than RTCR, and you have to indicate weeks for different locations. So here is the addendum form. I included it with the email that we sent out to you guys, and it's available on the website in the e-library. We're going to go through how the plan here hits all those required elements we just talked about, and then, like I said, we'll show some examples. So first of all, here's your representative sample locations. You'll recognize this very similar to the RTCR sample siting plan, and in fact, you know, with the overlap of the locations, you can just kind of reference the RTCR locations here for a lot of it. That second requirement element is that you're indicating if it's also used for these other sampling purposes like lead and copper or disinfection byproducts. Here's the representative location, and we use a code, which we did in RTCR as well, and those are defined in the instructions, like is it just a general distribution location, or is it also a area of high water age type of thing. Here you're indicating whether it's an online analyzer out in the distribution or a grab sample that you're doing, and then the frequency, which is where we'll specify the different weeks for the locations that you'll see. And if it's online, of course, it's continuous. Okay, so stepping back then and thinking about your own plan and completing this DRR plan. Well, the first step, and I keep kind of mentioning the overlap with the RTCR and how it's an addendum to it. So the first step is to review your RTCR sample siting plan. Remember, you're using those same sampling locations as a start. Every time you're sampling for coliforms, you're sampling under the DRR rule as well. But do you want to or do you need to add additional locations for disinfection monitoring? Maybe, if you're only sampling once per month for coliforms, you could add some additional locations even for disinfection, or maybe you have some of these mixing zones where you're required to sample in for DRR. And then also look at if maybe you already sample weekly for coliforms, or do you need to add to your schedule for disinfection monitoring. So that would probably be the case for a lot of you. Okay, so let's look at some of these examples, and we have two different size systems, so hopefully we cover a lot of you. This first example is the Flowing Waters Community Water System, and it serves 617. So under the revised total coliform rule, they are required to sample once per month for coliforms, and they do have two locations, fortunately, 701 and 702. So they had set that up as representative monitoring under the coliform rule, and they alternate between those in differing months, just for coliforms. So here's their RTCR plan. Remember I said take a look at your RTCR plan first. And here they have listed 701 and 702. And the other pieces here, remember, are their check sample locations. Those are needed under RTCR. Nothing needs to be identified like that for the DRR. So there's their two locations that they alternate between. And they determine these are good representative locations: storage facilities, areas of high water age, an area with previous coliform detects. But they only sample once per month for coliforms since they're a small system. So let's look at how this plays out. Usually they sample in the second full week of the month on a Tuesday, the 13th, in this case in March. Now they have to do once a week residual sampling, so they'll stick to Tuesdays in their plan. So they're looking at week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 in March. But here's, again, when they get to, say, July or some months, there's going to be 5 Tuesdays in their case. So they have to identify a 5th week for a location. So that was their example here. So let's look at how they did this. So now we're looking at RTCR and the DRR monitoring. So this is DRR monitoring. In week 1, they collect their residual monitoring, and they could choose to do their coliform sample at that same time. However, that's identified in that plan for RTCR. But they're going to alternate in different weeks for DRR. So 701 the first week, 702 the second week, back to 701 in week 3, and week 4 is back to 702. And like we showed you in the calendar, they're going to have to identify a location that they will sample when a week 5 occurs for them. So they would identify that in the plan, and they'll be back at 701, they decided, for that for DRR. So let's show you that in the DRR plan here. First, we have our locations, 701 and 702, same locations as in RTCR. They overlap with RTCR, so that's shown here in that column. Here's the representative codes again, general distribution. 6 is area of high water age, so they've identified that, and 4 is finished water storage. They're doing grab samples, and here's where they show the sample frequency. So the plan, the template you'll see in the instructions calls for you to actually identify the weeks that you're sampling for these, and we showed you that in that kind of graphic. So they're alternating weeks, 1, 3, 2, 4 for 702, and then when a week 5 occurs, they have that identified in the plan for 701. So the bottom line is here, always identify in your plan a location for that week 5. When it does happen 4 times a year, essentially, you'll need that week 5. So that's a small system example, Flowing Waters. Now we'll move to example 2, a little bigger system, Upper Woods Water System, and they serve 10,000. They're required to sample 10 times per month, 10 coliforms under the RTCR rule, and here's their locations. You can see they have 10 of them here on this map. Under the RTCR, they sample for coliforms in weeks 1 and 3 of each month. That's when they kind of send out their sampling team, so weeks 1 and 3. Disinfectant residuals, of course, need to be collected weekly starting in 2019 there in April. So let's look at how they're planning to do this here. Week 1, this is DRR, and now it kind of overlaps with RTCR. Week 1, we said they're heading out and they're doing their RTCR monitoring, and of course they'll grab their DRR samples, or residual measurements, at that same time. So week 1, they cover 5 of their locations. And for this example, I'll then jump to week 3 for now, because that's when they're doing their other coliforms, and we see that they're grabbing their other 5 locations then. That's still with their RTCR. But we need a measurement for DRR in week 2. So in their plan, they're going to select 703. It's at least 1 sample for disinfectant residual per week. So for week 2, they're back at 703. They're covered for week 3 under our same sampling as RTCR. Week 4, they're identifying 704. They'll come back to. And then, of course, like we just discussed, they need a week 5 measurement for those months where that happens. And they're coming back to 710 for that one identified in their plan. So how does that play out? Here's the template again that we use. This is page 1, and you can see all their locations here, 701 through 705. Then we go to page 2, and we have 706 through 710 identified. And I'll stay on this page 2 and just show you the other elements here. These locations are also RTCR locations, so that's identified. The representative codes again, whether it's just general distribution or high water age, that sort of thing. These are all grab samples for this system. And then let's look at a little more detail in the frequency. Flipping back to page 1 of the plan, we showed you how in the graphic it kind of alternated there. So you can see that here, week 1, week 3, week 1, and then they have to tack on beyond just the weeks 1 and 3 for coliform monitoring. Here's one where it shows week 2, 703 will be sampled, and week 2, and then week 4, where there's no other coliform and DRR sampling going on, they'll do 704. So they're identifying these weeks in the plan. And here's page 2. There's their week 5 down there. They decided to go back to 710. So it helps to have that distribution map like we talked about in RTCR as well, and just kind of see where you're being representative when you're coming back in different weeks and everything. So now a thought from this is that Upper Woods samples for coliforms in weeks 1 and 3, and that's what they've been doing for a while now. With the DRR, they'll be sampling, sending somebody out, every week now. They could decide, and DEP would certainly like this, they could decide to spread the coliform sampling throughout the month as well. So they might do something like this, decide to revise their RTCR monitoring as well with DRR. And week 1, maybe they're doing 3 locations. Week 2, 3 locations. Week 3, 2 locations. Week 4, 2 locations. And then week 5 wouldn't be any coliform monitoring, but remember, we got to identify a residual measurement so they could come back to a location for that. So the idea is that you can certainly decide to revise your total coliform rule sample siting plan as well. You would just need to submit a revised sample siting plan for that and the DRR addendum, but remember to submit the revised plan to DEP as well. So you may decide to do that from looking at how you're going to be sampling for DRR versus RTCR and everything here. Another piece we want to cover, because it is in the template and an option in the rule, is an online analyzer out in the distribution. There's probably not too many of them now, but maybe something like at a storage tank. We could say if this system did get an online analyzer permitted, and of course that would record residual on a continuous basis every 15 minutes is this one we could say. So you would identify that in your plan. Here is that same page 2 of the plan, but here in the red box, they would identify this as an online analyzer, and in the frequency, rather than the different weeks, you're simply identifying how that is recording on a continuous basis, whether it's every 15 minutes or whatever that is set to. So that's an online analyzer is an option out in the distribution system under this rule. Now, some large systems, when we initially talked about how DEP is going to have a template, the concern was brought up that a lot of these things it could be added to their own existing RTCR plan. So rather than the addendum form, you don't have to use that. You could add all those requirement elements to your existing RTCR plan, but it would have to definitely include all those required elements that we went over as columns in your RTCR plan. So that of course, you still need to submit something to DEP by that October 29th deadline. So then your revised RTCR plan, including all these required DRR elements, would get submitted to DEP. So again, this might be the case for some larger systems where you already have everything kind of in spreadsheet format or something to that effect. All right, some resources. So really the DRR webpage, the easiest way to get to it is search DEP DRR, maybe even PA DEP DRR. I'll get you there first. And this website contains this sample siting plan form. Like I said, we're going to put up the recording of this webinar. We will have information on upcoming training, further training. We have the chlorine residual reporting instructions, and we also have a link to method 334.0 information, which you've probably been hearing about through our training efforts on that. That links to the whole method 334 website, which has some tutorial videos and everything now as well on that. So our current focus is on these sample siting plans. We're not doing additional classroom training on sample siting plans, but we do plan compliance classroom training like some of DEP's traditional regulatory training in the first quarter of 2019 to get you ready for the April start of everything, or the other elements there. Also, for you surface water systems, we're planning workshops for the Giardia inactivation and those requirements in the new rule. And you've probably seen the advertisements for Method 334 training, and we're continuing on. If we haven't come to your region yet, look out for that, since that is tied to disinfection monitoring and those QA/QC requirements. So, bottom line is, though, this plan is due by October 29th, and just like RTCR, you're submitting the plan to your local DEP office. Okay, so now is some time for a kind of Q&A session. I believe it's called you see it listed as Q&A or chat in your kind of lower right-hand side window of the screen. This will be the easiest way for us to kind of take some time and look at your questions and then respond. We'll try to respond verbally to everybody so that everybody will kind of repeat the question. But the easiest way for you to get them in there is to use that chat box. So we'll take you won't hear us speaking for a little while, a break from that, and give you some time to get some questions in, and we'll respond to those.
Hi, this is Dawn Hissner. We're going to start answering some of these questions. General categories, reporting. Reporting requirements. You continue to report the data monthly, as you have been doing. You continue to report the data using the SCWA1 format, as you are now doing. So the reporting requirements are not going to change. If you haven't already transitioned to the new contaminant codes and updated method codes, you will need to make sure over the next several months you're reporting that way with the specific code matching the residual that's being measured and the appropriate corresponding method code. You are not required to sample the same day every week. We're sort of, again, allowing water systems to evaluate their distribution system and look at their monitoring as a whole and sort of do what makes sense as representative both through time and throughout the distribution system locations. The online analyzers, you're not required to have one. This was an option for some of the systems that specifically asked if they wanted to install them. The water supplier determines the frequency of the recording as far as how often the instrument's going to store the measurement. What gets reported at the end of the month, it'd be an average for the day for an online analyzer. If you are taking multiple grab samples at the same location in the same day, you report all those individual results. For an online analyzer, you tell us how often the instrument's going to be recording a measurement, and then you report one daily average value for that location for that day. Yes, you can repeat locations throughout the month. That's already happening with our TCR, so we fully expected that would continue for some of the smaller systems. And so if you go to the same location 2 weeks in a row, that's legitimate. Just noted in the plan. Non-transient, non-community water systems. Any non-transient, non-community water system with chlorine disinfection is going to be covered under the DRR. It's the transient non-communities that have 4-log or that have filtration. That's the difference. We got questions about what happens if the residual is too low. This will be covered a lot more in the compliance training, but right now the regulations require that if any one location has a residual below the 0.2 for any given day, that location be sampled the following month. If it's already part of your routine monitoring every month, it's nothing extra. If it's a smaller system where you rotate between locations from month to month, you may have an additional sample that following month. If the same location is below the minimum of 0.2 for 2 months in a row, the water system will be doing an investigation into why and what kind of corrective actions need to happen and then submitting a report. And again, we'll cover that in more detail in the classroom training session. If the month ends midweek, which it often does, do you need to collect 2 samples for that week, 1 for each month, or not? And the answer is it's at least 1 measurement per week. Doesn't matter if that week is split between 2 calendar months or not. A minimum of at least 1 residual measurement once a week. For larger systems, hopefully you're evaluating, you're going to be doing more than 1, but it's at least minimum 1 residual measurement per week. You report the data with the month in which the sample was taken. So if it's a split week and you measure residual in February, you report that with your February data. If you measure the residual later in the week and it falls in March, then you report that measurement with the rest of your March data. If you have different RTCR sampling amounts per month for seasonal systems or systems that have seasonal fluctuations, you're going to have months where you have more samples than normal, say summer months. Again, you would just note those locations on your DRR plan, and that's why this is an addendum to your RTCR plan, because we We know we have that kind of variation, so you would just note that some months you're doing those locations more than others. It's not a significant hiccup. If you have a water system where you're a single service connection, it's a single building, should you be sampling at the same location every week? If you're small enough that you really only have one location, sure. If you have a couple of different sinks or a couple of different floors, you might want to, vary, but that's your choice. One location, the same location every week would be acceptable for a small single building connection. Deadline for submitting the sample siting plan, as noted, is October 29th. To the local DEP office, please do not send them into central office in Harrisburg. Reporting online analyzers for storage tanks. If that storage tank location is a location that you determine should be a DRR location, as we noted before, you would assign that a location ID. You would tell us how often the instrument is recording a measurement, and then you report a daily average. I'm reading questions as we go through. If your scheduled residual measurement falls on a holiday, no, you don't have to sample that day if that's how we're looking at the plan as if you want to be saying we're just going to sample these locations weeks 1, 2, and 3, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to specify specific days. If you choose to be that detailed, that's fine, but we're looking to just verify that you have representative locations during the month throughout the distribution system and that you are able to document that you will be sampling at least once a week. How should sites be numbered if they're not existing RTCR or TTHM sites? Again, it's pick a number that's 3 digits between 700 and 999 as long as it's not already assigned to an existing location. Who signs the plan? Ideally, the owner or the responsible official. If that person designates the operator as being the one to sign the plan, we'll accept that as well. Operator and responsible charge or appropriately certified operator is acceptable. Who may report? Whoever has the appropriate dweller account, whether it's the certified operator. If you are a water system that contracts with an accredited lab to do your coliform sampling, but you don't want to pay them to come out during weeks that you're not having coliform samples collected, you could have the lab reporting the residuals for the measurements they took, and you would be reporting the measurements for the residuals that you take in those intervening weeks. That's why we are switching to getting all of the individual results to allow that sort of difference. Whom can do the measurements? It's the same as it is currently right now. It's a lab that's accredited, an appropriately certified operator, or an individual working with an SOP provided by an appropriately certified operator for the communities and the non-transients, and even the transients that are required to comply with DRR. Are the amount of number of samples for DRR the same as for RTCR? For systems that are doing more than 4 or more a month, possibly, probably. For the smaller systems, you will have more DRR measurements than you will RTCR measurements because you have to do at least 1 a week under DRR. If your plan is submitted and it's determined to be incomplete or insufficient, the department would then work with you between October and April to provide, the missing documentation or information that's necessary, which is why we allow that time lag between due date for the plan and compliance date for the monitoring and compliance. If a weekly sample is missed, is a Tier 3 PN required? Yes, if you fail to do the required monitoring, it is a monitoring violation and Tier 3 public notice would be required. The online analyzer option that I mentioned only applies if you choose to install a continuous analyzer in the distribution system. All of this conversation that we talked about does not apply or change how you are operating and maintaining your entry point residual and your entry point online analyzers. Entry point monitoring is continuous with recording at least every 15 minutes. You're reporting the lowest of the day for entry point residuals. It's a different number that has to be met. None of that is changing. We are going to transition the reporting contaminant codes and method codes for the entry point data to match. So you will be reporting a specific contaminant code for the residual that's being measured with the corresponding method code. But that's the only change to the entry point requirements. The minimum moving forward as of April 29th, 2019 is 0.2 for distribution system measurements. For filter plants, the entry point is currently 0.20. And yes, there is a difference. We'll get into that in more detail when we do the compliance training. Is it okay to round the result if it's measured at 0.15 or above? We will accept 0.15 or above for distribution measurements. We prefer that you report the measurement that you actually obtained, that you do not round when reporting the data. If we have a population of 10,000, how many samples a week is necessary? Well, hopefully, with a population of 10,000, your RTCR locations should be spread out throughout the system and throughout the month. As long as you're doing at least one a week, then you're likely to meet the DRR requirements with your RTCR sampling locations. There is no weekly reporting. The data gets reported once a month. So you're doing weekly measurements, but you're reporting the data once a month. So I think we'll take another short pause to see if there's any additional questions before we wrap up. For the smaller systems, we had a question in regarding the example. If you are only required to do one RTCR sample a month and you have two locations you're rotating between, and you want to do alternate locations in the same week every other month, how would you note that on the plan? You'd have to handwrite that in as a footnote. If your only required to do one RTCR location a month, and you currently alternate RTCR locations between months, then you should really be measuring both locations every other week. So week 1 would be 701, week 2 would be 702, week 3 could be back to 701, and week 4 could be 702. So that's where the difference is going to come in. If you're currently alternating locations because you're only doing 1 or 2 RTCR samples a month, you may end up actually doing residual measurements at those locations each week. So you may not be alternating as much for DRR.
Okay, and this is Bill again. Yeah, we'll try to clarify with maybe an example, a modified example for that flowing waters first one if they're alternating. It's just a matter of how you're going to indicate that in the plan that when you're alternating between 2 locations, how does that fall with TCR versus DRR? So we'll have to probably add some kind of note of when they're sampling in different months in that column, but we'll post an example with the webinar here. And I did see some questions of when we'll have the recording up and the PowerPoint. Probably be about a week because it has to go through our policy office and get posted and everything for the web. So probably about a week. The recording will be up there and we'll get the examples up there and everything. So I think that is about it. Further questions, don't hesitate to talk to your local sanitarians and local staff when you're working on your plan, and we'll be discussing